Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekalona, and this is Nashville. Political scandals. They get even more eyes than a Hollywood disgrace. And it kind of makes sense. When elected leaders are involved in a scandal, that means they broke not only the law, but the public's trust and faith. Our state has been rocked by political scandal more than a few times. Later this hour, we're going to get to that when we rebroadcast an interview with three writers who will tell us more about the most crooked, double-dealing, and nefarious stories of our state's history. But now let's learn about a new scandal that's been in the news. A recent investigation found that Nashville District Attorney Glenn Funk had installed a surveillance system throughout his office and secretly recorded defense attorneys and members of his own staff without their knowledge. That could amount to a constitutional violation, according to the report from the state's comptroller and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Joining us now is WPLN reporter Marianna Bacallao with more. Marianna, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Okay, help us break this down. Cameras are visible. It's common for them to be in the office, or you might want to keep an eye on who's coming and going. Does this make that a potential offense?
Well, most security cameras don't record audio, and especially not in the places these microphones were installed. There's a viewing room in the DA's office that defense attorneys use to review evidence. They usually spend a lot of time in there alone or with their clients discussing details of the case. These microphones can also pick up on people talking in hallways or common spaces who weren't aware they were being recorded. And that's been the case since at least 2021. The investigation found that's when government funds were used to implement this new surveillance system.
Okay, so talk to me more about this report. What did state investigators uncover?
The TBI and the state's comptroller's office found those recordings were turned over to the prosecutors working on those cases. Emails included in the report show that prosecutors in the DA's office were able to request recordings of particular defense attorneys. And investigators found that members of the DA's staff were expected to help with Funk's 2022 re-election campaign. After questioned about that, Funk had created a PTO system specifically for employees to reclaim time they spent working on his campaign.
All right. So what rules or laws does this report say that DA's office violated with the practice of these recordings?
So the report says it's a violation of attorney-client privilege, and it doesn't guarantee Nashvillians' Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, since the things a client might tell their attorney are different from what they might say to a judge or a jury. Also, Tennessee's rules require a lawyer to destroy any information they may have accidentally received regarding another lawyer's client and notify the client or the attorney.
Okay, so did defense attorneys know they were being recorded? I feel like you have. I mean, it's a pretty easy answer for this.
I mean, no, not really. Defense attorneys tell investigators they didn't know they were being recorded and were never told after the fact. That's counter to that state rule we were just talking about. But Funk maintains that there's no expectation of privacy anywhere in the DA's office. So those defense attorneys shouldn't have been discussing details of the case they didn't want his office to know.
Okay, so in light of this new information, how are defense attorneys responding?
They're making appeals. At least one murder trial has been delayed since the report shows the defendant's attorney had been surveilled in the DA's viewing room. There's a chilling implication for a lot of these cases and whether the people involved were given a fair trial. Metro Public Defender Martesha Moore says that she's asking for the DA to disclose all the cases in which surveillance was used. And if he does, we can expect more appeals to follow. We did hear from one defense attorney who agreed with Funk that there isn't really an expectation of privacy. But Moore says that a practice like this erodes trust in the justice system for people like her clients who may already view the courts as inherently unfair.
All right, so I'm thinking about this. Besides the defense attorneys, who else was affected?
I mean, employees largely. While visitors were also recorded, the report focuses mainly on the consequences for defense attorneys and members of Funk's own staff. One former assistant district attorney had a particularly harrowing experience with that. A member of her family posted on social media that they supported a rival for Funk's 2022 re-election campaign. The former assistant district attorney in question told investigators that Funk had confronted her about the social media post and that she had felt pressure to make a $500 donation to his re-election campaign to stay in his good standing. After that point, the DA pointed cameras specifically at her office, had other staff members keep detailed notes of her comings and goings, and had her reassigned to a grant-funded position. And text messages uncovered as part of the investigation show Funk had been considering firing her over this social media post of a relative, but decided against it, arguing that this unnamed rival could have used it against him. And an unnamed person in the text messages advised Funk to, quote, keep her on a tight leash until May, then you can fire her if you want, end quote. She resigned from the position sometime that summer.
Now, you obtained a letter from Tennessee Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti saying that he will not prosecute Funk or his office. Why not?
Yeah, that's the question. In his letter, Skrmetti said there isn't sufficient evidence that the DA's office used the recordings improperly. And Funk's office agreed with this sentiment, but Skrmetti also calls the practice troubling and that he was particularly concerned about the possibility of Funk recording the crimes against children room.
Without the AG, tell me what's next for this case.
The state's comptroller is asking for a special prosecutor to be assigned to Funk's case. That's something Senate Speaker Randy McNally has also supported. It's possible he could be investigated by other boards across the state, but that's still something we're waiting to see.
We will wait to see as the shoes continue to drop. That is WPLN's Marianna Bacallao. You can find her story on this scandal at WPLN.org. Marianna, thanks for your reporting. Thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll learn some about the history of political corruption in Tennessee when we visit the story of former Governor Ray Blanton. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville.
In one of his last acts as governor of Tennessee, Ray Blanton, a target of a federal investigation of an alleged parole-selling scheme, has cut the sentences of a number of murderers and other convicts. Bruce Hall has the details.
The FBI has filed affidavits with a federal grand jury saying that Governor Ray Blanton either had knowledge of or participated in a scheme in the governor's office to sell pardons to state prisoners. With only 4 days left in office, Blanton stunned the state with a middle-of-the-night announcement that he had granted executive clemency to another 52 prisoners, including 26 murderers. And he says he is not through yet.
That was a clip from CBS News broadcasted on January 15th, 1979, featuring the legendary Walter Cronkite and reporter Bruce Hall. They reported on the activities of Ray Blanton, former governor of Tennessee. As you heard, he granted clemency to 50, count 'em 50 prisoners while in his last few weeks of office. This news was shocking to the public in Tennessee and across the nation. Blanton's actions caused great concern with lawmakers and law enforcement. So much so that they took an action that had never been done before in American history. My next guest knows all about the moves, and he wrote a book about it. Keel is the author of Coup, the day the Democrats ousted their governor, put Republican Lamar Alexander in office early, and stopped a pardon scandal. He's also a columnist for the Tennessean, Keel. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to This is Nashville.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Really appreciate it. You know what I love about that clip? Even the great Walter Cronkite had a stumble from time to time. Makes you, as a broadcaster, it makes you feel pretty good. Now, we're here talking about Governor Ray Blanton. This is really quite the story. Can you give us some quick background on who Ray Blanton was?
Sure. Well, the ouster of Governor Blanton in January 1979 was certainly not the first scandal in Tennessee, state capital, and it was not the last, but it got the attention of the country, as your Cronkite clip indicates. And there was a lot that was of great interest to the FBI just as soon as Governor Blanton took office in 1974, and they never lost their attention on his time in office. So much so that when he approached the final couple of months in his time, he was removed from office because of things that were going on, and the leaders of Blanton's own party, as well as the feds, were highly interested in what else he might do before he left. So the sort of end of the nutshell is that his successor, who'd been elected the previous November, Lamar Alexander, was sworn into office 3 days early, because that's the only way the authorities could figure out how to remove Blanton from power, because they were very concerned that there might be more pardons and clemencies coming.
All right, so take me back in time a little bit. What was the political landscape in Tennessee like in the 70s?
Well, it's in many respects, Khalil, it was just the opposite of what it is now in terms of political representation. There were virtually no Republicans in the state capitol. At that time, all three of our statewide elected officials, the governor and the two U.S. senators, were all Democrats up until 1968, when Senator Howard Baker was elected U.S. Senator. The both houses of our state legislature were overwhelmingly Democratic in their majorities. Therefore, the two speakers were both Democrats, and our congressional delegation was predominantly Democrat. I think there was only one Republican in the delegation from Tennessee, and today it's just the opposite. Mm-hmm. So you have, what we commonly call the supermajority. Republican has evolved since then, and most of that transition occurred in the early aughts.
Okay. Now, Blanton, what was his reputation like early on in his political career?
Well, he was. He had been a U.S. congressman from West Tennessee. He'd been in the legislature before that. He never really distinguished himself. And in 1974, he ran for governor. I remember there were 12 Democrats in that primary. There were 4 Republicans. But we still don't have a runoff law in Tennessee. So Blanton became the Democratic nominee for governor with 23% of the vote in that primary. And, which on one level is crazy, but on the other level, that was the system, and he became the nominee. Meanwhile, Lamar Alexander became the Republican nominee, and they faced each other that November. And so Blanton won. I mean, he was probably the best known name, in all that. And meanwhile, Alexander will tell you today that also became the fall when President Ford pardoned President Nixon for the Watergate crimes, and you virtually couldn't find a traditional Republican voter anywhere in the state who voted for the Democrats or the Republican Party. There was so much upsetting concern about what Watergate had done, what it meant, and so Alexander. That's not the only reason he lost that election in '74, but he lost. Then he decided between then and the next election, 1978, to try again.
Now, for Blanton's governorship, how did Tennesseans view it? Was he popular? Was he effective?
Well, I think his people would say now, looking back, that he was effective in some respects. He put a big emphasis on agricultural exports. He had grown up in sort of rural West Tennessee, and had gone to University of Tennessee at Martin and had that whole background. And he emphasized agricultural products and so forth. But he didn't distinguish himself in most of the common ways. He was not a bold policymaker. He basically ran an administration. Now, there were plenty. Let me hasten to say there were plenty of good people in the Blanton administration that took office in January '75. Most of the trouble that ensued was in the governor's office, and where the governor's legal counsel, as part of the FBI investigation, was arrested in December of '78. Blanton's still in office with cash in his pocket. I mean, the FBI had found money on him that turned out it was sort of meant to go to as a payoff for one of the clemency scandals. People by this time were being let out of prison, and you mentioned the numbers, 50 and so forth. Convicts were being let out of prison for all the wrong reasons, and most of those reasons involved money. Blanton's the head of his security detail was a lieutenant on the Tennessee Highway Patrol. He was arrested the same day, and the governor's parole officer, who reported to the legal counsel, was arrested with a he was about to board a plane at the Nashville airport going to Memphis, where he was taking clemency documents as sort of the completion of the payoff for a particular prisoner, and that was stopped in its tracks. So
wow,
that's what set in motion all the worry on the part of the authorities, FBI, U.S. Attorney, State Attorney General, that led to the early swearing in of Alexander on the night of January 17th, '79.
Okay, now you mentioned that Blanton was on the FBI's radar essentially from the time he took office, and you just told a little bit about the big scandal right now, but there were other ones he was involved in, you alluded to. What else was he involved with scandal-wise?
Well, I interviewed a former FBI agent who said, Keel, I understand most of the news media at the time gave attention to the pardon and parole scandal, which the news media around here began to refer to as the clemency for cash scandal. This former agent said, look, I understand all the interest in that. It was awful. But there were plenty of other kinds of corruption. He went on to characterize highway construction, bid rigging, which is illegal. Governor's brother went to prison over that. Governor Blanton himself went to prison over something not related at all to the clemency for cash scandal, but to the improper handling of liquor store licensing. So you had all of this surplus cars were being. So, some people said at the time that state government in Tennessee is open for business and anything's for sale.
Yeah, okay, that's quite the quote, and seems that Blanton had his hands in every little seedy pot and plot that one could think of, and this big scandal is more like this cauldron that he's stirring up. You mentioned that the authorities, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, and local lawmakers were really concerned with his actions. Why were they concerned about him pardoning so many people who were incarcerated at that time?
Well, for one thing, the activity on January 17th, the negotiations between the U.S. Attorney, the State Attorney General, Alexander and his people, and the two speakers, they had decided all that had to happen in private because they didn't know what else Blanton might do. By this time in his short administration, he had become erratic. He had a drinking problem. He would be drunk by the middle of the afternoon. They didn't know what he might do next, and possibly out of spite, should he get word. There was concern that as long as he was governor, he was in control of the Highway Patrol, the National Guard, and that if it came down to it, he might deploy one or the other or both to help him hold on to his office.
Wow.
And that suddenly, if Alexander was in fact to be sworn in at 6 p.m. that night, which he was, we could wind up all in the news, national news all over again, because Tennessee would unfortunately have two governors, and everybody would have egg on their face, other than, and to say nothing of what other kind of wrongdoing might occur, because he would be governor until the Saturday of that week. This is now Wednesday evening, and they didn't know what he might do.
I'd like to introduce my next guests. They've written a new book about political scandals in our state's history. Erik Schelzig and Joel Ebert are the co-authors of Welcome to Capitol Hill, 50 Years of Scandal in Tennessee. Erik, Joel, welcome to This is Nashville. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So when you hear this story about Ray Blanton, what comes to your mind, Erik?
Well, he was sort of the inspiration for this book that we did. Joel, when he was at the Tennessean, ended up doing a retrospective on this, and we decided that there's all kinds of scandals that have happened in Tennessee over the years, some of which we covered, and some of them are before our time. But figured it was time to write them down so they don't get forgotten.
All right, Joel, what do you think when you hear about Ray Blanton and his activities?
Yeah, he was somebody that was a gregarious character, right? There's many politicians that you see today that are quite lively figures who feel they can't do anything wrong, and he was somebody that wasn't really afraid of pushing back against the media, and so I think that again rings true in this politically charged environment that we're in today.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Colonna. We're talking this hour about Tennessee's history with political corruption with authors Keel Hunt, Erik Schelzig, and Joel Ebert. You can share your comments with us at This is Nashville. Now, Keel, you had an up-close and personal look, because at the time you were Lamar Alexander's speechwriter. What were you experiencing?
Well, I was not in the room when the agreement was made to swear Alexander in early. Some very important and effective staff members were. I was just off doing something else, and when it went down that evening, this is on a Wednesday night, January 17th of 79, that was a Wednesday, I was out at Vanderbilt helping to kind of team teach a seminar and every Wednesday, and this whole thing went down while I was out there. I got back to the transition headquarters. By this point, of course, Alexander had been elected and was in the process of assembling his cabinet, his new administration. And I went by the transition office, and a fellow sitting there watching TV, he was the only one in the office, and he says, "Do you know what's happened?" And I did not. So I'm kind of proud of the research I was able to do with the help of 100 plus interviewees, assembling the story. But I was not there. I had gotten to know Alexander pretty darn well, and became a member of his staff. And so in that way, for the next 4 to 6 months, everything was about how to sort that out, how to prepare the new Alexander administration to be in office. It was incumbent on him, for example, to work very closely with the Democratic leadership in the legislature, and that's part of the story, the ensuing story. And I developed a lot of respect for Speaker Ned McWhorter, for example, and Lieutenant Governor John Wilder. They're both gone now.
Now, one of the people that Blanton pardoned was Roger Humphreys. who was convicted of killing his ex-wife and her boyfriend in a really gruesome murder, if you go back and read about it. His father was a political associate of Blanton's. So, Joel, what was the reaction to Humphreys being released and given a job with the state as a photographer?
It was actually came out, the arrangement of him being a state photographer was when he was still in prison. And it was an arrangement that was highlighted by the Tennessee Journal at the time. And the reaction was just shock and awe. People were confused why there was this special arrangement. Then you heard the governor basically defend Roger Humphreys in an interview that was very combative. He called him a fine young man. And that led to a lot of other people being concerned about what he might do. Blanton vowed to potentially pardon him. And you saw, a back and forth. He kind of backpedaled at one point. Then he reasserted that he had plans to do that. And you had, John J. Hooker at the time say, we can't have this. There were all kinds of people, Keel, that I'm sure you remember were really hyper focused on that issue because, Roger Humphreys was not a fine young man.
Mm-hmm. Now, days before Lamar Alexander was to be inaugurated, this quick and secretive move that Keel has recounted for us a little bit was made by groups, including the U.S. attorney at the time. Erik, what does that level of secrecy with law enforcement and lawmakers that they were involved with, what does that tell you about how worried they were?
Well, of course, as a journalist, I can only imagine it would have driven me crazy at the time to not be in on what was going on. As my understanding is the press corps was generally aware that things were happening and were told to stand by and were around. And I'm sure Keel could talk more about that from his perspective. But the fact that they all got together and especially across party lines to hammer out this deal and to do it sort of under the cover of darkness speaks to just how important they felt it was to avoid more sort of hardened criminals getting out on the street just because, Blanton wanted to and might have been getting money for it.
Hardened criminals getting out on the street. Keel, were there any people behind bars that were also being considered by Blanton's team and he and his team for clemency that lawmakers were really, truly worried about?
Well, probably more so than lawmakers because they were not really in the loop of what was going down, but rather law enforcement, the U.S. attorney and FBI and so forth. And they were concerned that others might be released. There were certain persons of interest among the prisoners that they, for whatever reason, thought might be susceptible to corrupt release. And there was even a thought at the time that these people were capable of anything, that the Blanton inner circle might even have James Earl Ray, the assassin of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who at that time, Ray, was in a Tennessee prison in the East State, that he might be possibly released. And there's an interesting episode in my book about how they came to fear that. And they thought, well, if he might be released, and they asked a fellow who was an informant for the FBI in an interview situation, asked. They said, well, how far could this go? What about who is the hardest, meanest prisoner? And he named one or two, and they said, well, what about James Earl Ray? This is the undercover FBI agent asking this question. And the fellow in the interview room was in a motel in Memphis being recorded. And he said, well, that's a hot one. He said, I don't think we could pardon him and get away with it. But maybe we could help him escape.
Wow.
And to this day, Khalil, I mean, my blood runs cold. These people were capable of anything. They were shameless. They were corrupt.
Yeah.
And here we are. So.
And in your book, you reported that they were selling these pardons for about $25,000 a pop at the time.
Yeah, there was one that went for about $90,000.
Wow.
And that I learned. And the layers of this scandal, were almost unlimited.
And since you mentioned that a lot of the Democratic delegation leadership, they were Democrats in office.
Yeah.
They worked together with the incoming governor, Lamar Alexander, the U.S. attorney, and law enforcement to look over the rules to decide to remove Blanton from office early. These are Democrats removing another Democrat, right. People that Blanton is friends and political allies with. What did that tell you about the importance of what the move they were making and the political climate at the time?
Well, first of all, it said worlds to me about the value of inter-party cooperation even in the worst situations, and this arguably was that. Speaker Ned McWhorter, who actually became governor himself later on following Alexander, was of the highest character, and he was a very different type personality from Alexander, and yet they were able to fashion a common ground, and I believe that affected their capacity to work together successfully across the aisle over the following 8 years, whereupon McWhorter became governor.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, working successfully across the aisle. These days, I don't know if we have so much of that. And let me ask you this, Erik and Joel. Do you think something similar could happen today? I mean, would we have this level or that level of political cooperation in today's climate?
It's kind of hard to hypothesize on what the scandal would have to be to make that happen. Certainly in several of the scandals we've looked at, the initial response was to circle the wagons and to sort of protect your own, as it were, Democrats helping out Democrats or Republicans helping out Republicans until it becomes sort of untenable, and then things sort of start to wane a little bit. But in terms of a governor, again, the circumstances would have to be exactly right, and it's hard to imagine what they would be to get that kind of cooperation.
Joel, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Right now, it seems like you've got more opposition to cooperation than we've seen in quite some time, both on the federal and oftentimes state level. That's kind of that animosity toward the other party has really trickled down on state legislatures. So it would have to be a perfect confluence of events, and I don't know what that would be right now.
Keel, final question for you. What's the lesson in all of this for Tennesseans?
I think voting matters. It matters who is in office. I've been asked many times over the 10 years since my book, The Coup, came out, do you think this would happen today? And it's connected to what Joel just said, and Erik, that we don't, it's hard to hypothesize, as Erik said, what the crime might be that would call forth this kind of response. But it the lesson of history is that stuff happens, and things go wrong, and people, and corruption happens. And so I would like to think that the present-day office holders might rise to the occasion in this way. My concern about that is that what the two things that make the big difference now in our elected leadership, particularly at the state capitol, is, first of all, extremism, and the fact that everything seems to be in response to a national political agenda, in this case, the National Republican Party, and we can pin that on whoever we want to. Certainly, Donald Trump has had a big impact on that, and he wants to be president again. So, but I think the capacity of these individuals who were in this story in 1979 to set aside pure partisanship and do what needed to be done is an extraordinary case study, and that it, but it matters who we vote for, and that's without even getting to the notion of gerrymandering, which they've also done.
That's a whole
in the modern era, a whole other show.
It's a whole nother show. I want to thank you, my guest, Keel Hunt. He's the author of Coup, The Day that Democrats Ousted Their Governor, Put Republican Lamar Alexander in Office Early, and Stopped a Pardon Scandal. Keel, it's a riveting book. Thank you so much for being with us and telling us that story.
Thank you, Khalil.
Erik Schelzig and Joel Ebert will stick with us through the break. When we come back, we'll learn about some of the other political scandals that rocked our state. One even goes back to 1797. Get your popcorn ready. You can join the conversation by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. Political scandals are nothing new. As long as there's power to be wielded, some people will choose to use that power for self-serving purposes. It's the risk we take when electing lawmakers and officials. We trust that they'll do the right thing. But when that trust is misplaced or broken, well, as my grandmother used to say, sugar, we got some things to work out. Now, before the break, we heard about the movie-like scandal involving former Governor Ray Blanton. Now let's take a look at some of the other political scandals in our state's history. For that, we're joined again by Erik Schelzig and Joel Ebert, the co-authors of Welcome to Capitol Hill, 50 Years of Scandal in Tennessee. Gentlemen, thanks again for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so you both got into the history of the scandals for the state. Erik, what led you both to write about these stories?
Well, to some extent, it was the folly of the pandemic. We thought we'd have all kinds of time on our hands, and as it turned out, it was a lot of work to do this. But we basically decided it was time to try to, put together some of the stories we had covered ourselves as State House reporters in Nashville, and also the stuff that came before us, and basically immortalize that so people could know what happened before in the past before they go do it again.
How many scandals did you find?
Very many. We sort of had to decide to narrow it down to essentially 5 or 6. And then we included an appendix at the back of the book that's called Lawmakers Behaving Badly to sort of list some of the lesser scandals over time that still need to be chronicled as well.
So you narrowed them down. Joel, how did you choose which ones to use in the book?
Well, there's obvious ones, right? So the first one, we kind of go in chronological order, and we begin with Ray Blanton. Just seemed to be, of course, fitting to follow up Keel's book and kind of go into the history of Blanton a little bit more too. And then we knew we had to hit the highlights of some of these major investigations. So one of them is Operation Rocky Top, which was a federal investigation into lawmakers' bingo operations, essentially illegal bingo. Another one was Tennessee Waltz, which was a major event that occurred in 2005. And so we kind of knew we had to mix those older ones and then also kind of fit in the more recent ones that we both personally covered. And so it was actually kind of a nice break where we had several featuring Democrats as targets and then several at the end that were Republicans. So bipartisan corruption.
Yes, it happens. One of the oldest scandals you found goes way back to the state's first year of actually being in the United States, 1797. Erik, real quick, tell us who was involved and what happened.
Let me hand it off to Joel. He actually wrote up most of that.
It was actually William Blount, so he's a U.S. Senator at the time, and he was one of the founders of the state, and he has this idea that he has land off of the Mississippi River, and he is going to sell it in some capacity and make a profit for it. Eventually, it was found out that this was going to potentially benefit him, and the U.S. Senate, reacts with a decision to expel him, and he's actually the first member of the U.S. Senate to be expelled. And this is before, there was any real prospect of, is this, should we send him to prison or something like that? So this goes down, and he ends up being hailed in the state. He comes back to Tennessee, and he later joins the legislature, which is, quite a difference of reaction between the feds and the state.
There's a county named after him, right?
Yes.
So he gets impeached by the Senate.
Yep.
And back home, he gets a county named after him. Was this like the first test of impeachment in the Constitution?
I believe it was, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something. Okay, so we're going to move on to those not so humble beginnings to something that happened in the 80s. You mentioned it in the Rocky Top scandal. What were the goods? What happened there?
So basically, there was an investigation after there was a tip to Randy McNally, who is now the lieutenant governor, but he was a low-level lawmaker at the time, a Republican. Again, Democrats had the majority at that point, and there was a tipster essentially saying there's something not right about charitable bingo in Tennessee. Basically, you were allowed to have gambling in some sense in Tennessee as long as it was for, quote, charity purposes. McNally started to sniff around and ended up giving a suggestion to the FBI after he was bribed by essentially a member of the Tennessee bingo operations.
Okay.
And it was just this long, complex scandal that had multifaceted tentacles that went into the Secretary of State's office. You saw a couple people end up committing suicide as the investigation unfolded, and eventually several lawmakers ended up going to prison for their roles in this scandal.
How much money are we talking about?
McNally, the initial bribe was $300.
Wow.
And then there were further bribes that exceeded that, I believe, in the $10,000 range. But, $300 to kind of secure a lawmaker at the beginning is, as he said, not very much money.
No, not much money at all. So what's the fallout from all this?
Well, I mean, in this instance and in several of the ensuing scandals, we see a reaction among lawmakers to try to clamp down a little bit on ethics rules, usually as little as necessary, but as much as possible. And then inevitably it feels like enthusiasm tends to wane and emotions get more lax, and then we have another scandal about a decade later. And this is sort of the repeat we see over and over again. So vigilance tends to wane, and evil doing resumes,
rises again. If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour about our state's history with political corruption with writers Erik Schelzig and Joel Ebert. You can share your comments at This Is Nashville. Okay, so we're moving into some of the 21st century scandals now. One that we covered here on WPLN, it involved former State House Speaker Glenn Cassida. Erik, remind us of what he's been accused of.
Well, we have sort of two chapters on him, or sort of spills over into another one. The first one is about his rise to power and then his precipitous fall, where he was caught up in a racist and sexist text messaging scandal with his chief of staff and was basically drummed out of the speakership, the first one in something like 125 years, not to finish his term as Speaker of the Tennessee House. Once he left office, he and this former chief of staff were indicted for allegedly running a sort of a shell corporation, a political vendor called Phoenix Solutions, and selling services to the state legislature to produce and mail political mail and surveys and correspondence. Basically, the Fed said that they were involved in a bribery and kickback scheme.
In his first ouster, I understand that his party mates did not really rally to support him the way that we would expect, right?
I think he sort of expected it too. I mean, when this sort of text messaging scandal erupted, he went on talk radio and said, this is just locker room talk, and sort of trying to channel Donald Trump a little bit, and said there's nothing else to come out. And unfortunately for him, my colleague Joel Ebert and others, the Tennessean, sort of covered various ensuing scandals that sort of made it untenable for him. And I'll hand it off to Joel to...
Yeah, I mean, he basically got in power and did everything that he could to piss off every party in aspect of even his own, right? So he took members that didn't vote for him of his own party and punished them by putting them in odd places, literally in the office suites that they have in the Cordell Hall building. He did not embrace, all aspects of the caucus. So he just really wanted to have Republicans, kind of his close circle, rally around him. And when the rubber met the road, ultimately there was enough, facing lawmakers that they weren't going to stand behind him. And so they held a no confidence vote. And it definitely came out as a surprise, I would say, for a party that normally was pretty unified.
Now, there's another lawmaker, Jeremy Durham, who is a former member of the House who sexually harassed 22 women.
At least.
What's his story?
So Durham was in office from around the 2013 era. Fast forward to about 2016, and actually my first week on the job at the Tennessean, there is a vote of whether they want to continue to keep Jeremy Durham in his leadership position. He was a Republican whip at the time. He was sort of seen as an up-and-coming political leader for the Republicans. But unbeknownst to many members of the party, he was quietly or not so quietly around the Capitol, advancing or attempting to advance sexually on lobbyists, staffers, etc. Our reporting initially found a few women who he had sent late night text message to that were, sexual in nature. That kind of blew the cover off of what was an open secret within the Capitol. And then eventually, the Attorney General leads an investigation and finds that he harassed at least 22 women.
I understand that his actions gave you all the idea for the book title, right?
Well, that's true. The AG's report that came out quoted an unnamed woman in the case saying that she had complained to Durham and said, this isn't right. You're married, and I don't know if she was an intern or a lobbyist or whatever. And he said, "Don't worry about it. Welcome to Capitol Hill. That's just the way things are here." Ron Ramsey, who was the Senate Speaker at the time, sort of recoiled at this and says, "When I hear that sort of talk, welcome to Capitol Hill, it makes me want to smack him in the mouth." And for Durham, that was that's when his support started to wane as well. He thought people would sort of rally around him, and they didn't. And he ended up getting ousted from the House, and at the time was just the second member to be thrown out of the State House since the Civil War. Of course, we've had three thrown out since, or two thrown out since, three attempts just last year. Yeah.
Okay. So I have about maybe 3 minutes left, and I know it's pretty crazy. It's an intense scandal, but I do want to talk about the Tennessee Waltz. Can you, as briefly as you can, break that down for us?
Well, the FBI heard about corruption within the Democratic caucus, both the House and the Senate, and essentially set up a sting operation with a fake company and called E-Cycle, and they set out to basically bribe lawmakers to pass legislation on their behalf. And then while they were handing over the cash or having their agents do so, they videotaped this, and there's video of basically 5 former lawmakers accepting cash bribes for this company, and they all went to prison.
Now, who are some of the lawmakers who got caught up?
The chief one, the biggest one is Senator John Ford, who is this very sort of gregarious and flamboyant lawmaker, longtime lawmaker who delighted in driving down I-40 at 100 miles an hour and was once charged with shooting a gun at a trucker and was acquitted. Was flouted ethics at every turn and sort of made a career out of this until it all came tumbling down in this scandal.
Now, Ford's actions, I hear, impacted his son's chances for statewide political office.
His nephew, actually, Harold Ford Jr., was running for Senate and lost to Bob Corker in what was a very tight race that year. He lost by less than 3 points, and his family certainly had a effect on that.
Okay, now, I'd love for both of you to answer this. As we kind of look at the state's history, we got these interesting people. We have these political scandals and these misdeeds. What should we, as Tennesseans, be thinking?
I would say, one of the important things is to remain ever vigilant and skeptical of who's in office, right? Political parties have a way of often trying to flex their muscles just for the sake of power, right? And we as voters have the ability to hold them to account, and we shouldn't be blinded by that party affiliation, because when that happens, that's when you see parties that don't care about, stepping over a boundary. So I think that's an important thing. Also, if you don't like who's in office, you can run for office, right? So this book can be a motivator in 2 ways, I would say.
Erik.
Well, I would agree. The thing that we found is this isn't a Democratic problem, and it's not a Republican problem. It's usually the arrogance of power that does in these people that we've covered in various cases. So, a lot of times we see the same responses to a scandal trying to circle the wagons, and it's a lot of times misplaced.
You both are journalists. Our guest in the previous segment, Keel Hunt, worked as a journalist. Is it important that we have more journalists out there covering government, covering the courts, covering these systems so that people can stay informed?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, of course. The more the better. I'm not sure how realistic that is anymore, but I think hopefully for journalists going forward, people tend to focus on the question of the day and the turn of the screw. And sometimes it's time to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and see what else is going on behind the scenes, which Joel did a lot for the Tennessean, and a lot of the material that we got for our book came from that.
And I do think that, the book really does highlight the value and the importance of journalism, right? One scandal we didn't even touch upon today is Brian Kelsey, who just got sentenced to 21 months in prison. He's a Republican, and that indictment very much mirrors reporting that I did at the Tennessean. So,
wow. I want to thank my guests, Erik Schelzig and Joel Ebert. They're the co-authors of Welcome to Capitol Hill, 50 Years of Scandal in Tennessee. It's a good book, y'all. Thank you both for coming on and sharing this important history with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Khalil.
And thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by Mary Mancini, the original produced by Char Daston. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Our technical director and board operator is Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme music are LaRange and Namir Blade. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. And the conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Find us on Instagram and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. You can call and leave us a message, 615-751-2500. We may use your message on air. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekalona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.